Laurie, do you want to take up some points?
Yes. I'm curious about this question of your own role, and we've talked a lot about it, but it is interesting. As you've explained, 1483 described the UK and the US as joint occupying authorities. It was a coalition provisional authority, not a United States provisional authority. And you certainly described how, within the administration, the two countries were pretty well integrated. But there is this question hanging over all of this of leadership. And you've talked about loyalty to an American plan. This wasn't a joint British-American plan, it was an American plan. Is that fair?
Yes, I was at the UN when the seven-step plan was drafted and agreed, and I'm sure that Sir John Sawyers had an input into that plan, but I didn't see how that happened or what conversations lay behind it. You're absolutely right that in theory we were co-responsible for Iraq. In practice we were a tenth or less of the practical capacity to do things in Iraq, and the practical normally was more influential than the theoretical in the way things happened.
And you've also described a sort of role that you picked up for yourself, which almost sounds like picking up from where you left off in the UN, except in very different circumstances. That is, working closely with the political leaders that you found around you who may or may not agree with anything that the UK was doing or the Americans were doing, but try to find a negotiated way through. Did you see this as being the particular application of the skills that you brought to Baghdad?
You tend to use the skills that you've honed over the years rather than trying to look for new ones, because that's the territory you're familiar with. And what we're talking about, Sir Lawrence, is working with a superpower that likes to do things its own way, and with the top decisions being taken by a closed circuit of Americans, and working with reality, those two things. The Brits probably work as well with the Americans as anybody does in an international situation. And the Americans were extremely generous to us in terms of integrating us into the system in the CPA. I was in an office within Bremer's area of the Republican Palace. So his office was at one end of a complex. Our joint private office, what you might call a third room in old Foreign Office terms, was between us, and I was in Saddam's deputy's office at the other end of the private office. So we were in the same complex. We saw a lot of each other's material when we decided to show it to each other, but there was a lot of American material that I never saw. There was, I think, a good spirit in the CPA of international cooperation, but absolutely no question at all that we were working to an American leadership. That American leadership was vociferous. The leadership of the military was different from the leadership of the civilian team. The leadership of the whole business from the Pentagon in Washington was different from the State Department, and not working well with the State Department, which produced the Arabists and the Arab world specialists that occasionally were or were not part of Bremer's team. I had to get my influence going in that system as best as I could by judging what was happening against what the reality on the ground was going to make happen, whether we liked it or not. And where the American decisions did not seem to accord with where gravity was taking events on the ground, I would try and use aspects of the situation to get the Americans to adjust their policy, because that backed up the arguments I was making. And I was used to doing that in the Security Council. And that helped, because the Americans are and were capable of taking decisions in the American domestic context that were not necessarily going to produce the results that they really wanted on the ground in a country like Iraq. And I was trying to mend the process when I saw that as being likely to happen.
And you described earlier, in answer to a question from Sir Martin, this meeting with the Prime Minister in early September, where he put a lot of stress on improving the police force. Now, everything we've heard about the Iraqi police force would indicate that that was totally unrealistic, whatever you and John Sawers decided to try to do to put together a plan. How was the unreality of some of the expectations in London fed back? It must have become very apparent as soon as you got to Baghdad, the role that the police force had played, as a paramilitary force, how hated it was, and how difficult it would be to build up anything to police Iraqi society effectively.
It must have been just as difficult for London as it was for me in Baghdad. I took the approach that if I disagreed with something that was happening on the ground and was trying to change it, that I would not go weeping to London about it and ask them to get Washington to persuade Bremer to do something differently. It was my job to persuade Bremer, or we had to go along with the administrator's decisions. London had a limited capacity anyway to disagree with Washington because Washington was in the lead. We had a relatively poor input into Pentagon decision-making, about which you've heard from other witnesses. And therefore, there was a sense of frustration in London that we couldn't always persuade the Americans to do what might be our preference because they were in charge, they were going to do their own thing anyway, and we had to try and make it work on the ground. So there was a sense of frustration in both places. Some things were going reasonably well, but the police area was not one of them. And frankly, in 2009, it still isn't one of them. It never came right, and we never got Iraqis to create a police force of the strength of Saddam's. The police training exercise was actually run by an extremely competent British former Chief Constable, Douglas Brand, whom the Americans hugely respected. But he had hardly any resources to do it with. He had to invent a training program, which we eventually did with Jordan, which produced a far lower number of recruits going through the system in far too short a training time than was realistic to create a decent police force on the ground. So actually the sense of hurry that we had from our two capitals militated against the production of well-trained, well-behaving policemen on the ground. So there was a tension there.